The next panel is on infrastructure challenges. I'm afraid that because of me, we've got a kind of an overloaded panel, 5 people, so rather than the usual 4, so our time's going to be a little tighter. The panel moderator is Charles Connerly, professor and director at the UI Urban and Regional Planning Program. Chuck joined the program in 2008. His research has been published widely in the top journals in his field, and his book, The Most Segregated City in America, City Planning and Civil Rights in Birmingham, was named one of the top 10 planning books in 2006, and in 2007 received the Paul Davidoff Award from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. So please welcome Chuck Connerly, who will introduce our panel.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief because we have 5 fine and wonderful speakers. And we're going to go in the order that's listed in the program. We're going to start with Joseph Gardner, who is with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO. Mr. Gardner is responsible for MISO's forward markets and operational processes, overseeing the administration of MISO's financial transmission rights market, the day-ahead energy and ancillary services market, transmission and markets, settlements, outage coordination, SEAMS administration, and tariff administration and scheduling. And I have no idea what I just said. But let me just finish introducing the other members of the panel. We have Raghuraman Mudumbai, Professor Mudumbai, joined the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department in the University of Iowa, at the University of Iowa in August 2009 as assistant professor. His research interests are in wireless communications and power systems. Next, we have Ramteen Sioshansi of Ohio State University. There, he is an associate professor in the Integrated Systems Engineering Department and an associate fellow in the Center for Automotive Research at Ohio State University. And he is followed by Manisha Patel, who is with the Council on Environmental Quality, Executive Office of the President of the United States. Ms. Patel serves as the Deputy General Counsel for the Council on Environmental Quality with the Executive Office of the President. And lastly, we have Ben York, and Ben is the Senior Project Director in the Electric Power Research Institute Distributed Energy Resource Program area and is Technical Coordinator for EPRI's Integrated Grid Concept. We're going to ask each of the panelists to limit their comments to between 10 and 12 minutes. So we'll begin with Mr. Gardner.
How did you draw the hardest names on panel? Yeah, I said, how did Chuck draw the hardest names of the day for one panel, all on one panel?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick question. Does anybody know who MISO is? Oh, wow, look at that. That's good. The previous gentleman talked about not liking blackouts. We really don't like blackouts because that's our responsibility, and when we do have a blackout, you'll know who we are. The news will make sure of that. So just to give you a sense of what we do and who we are, just very briefly, we cover the geographic center of the country from of the electric grid, and we go from the Canadian border all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and our responsibilities are twofold. First, to keep the lights on, and second, to use resources in the most efficient manner possible. So that is at the heart of what we do and what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to talk briefly about industry trends, talk a little bit about how the utility industry is going to be evolving over the next few years as a result of the Clean Power Plan and other environmental rules that have been promulgated. Talk a little bit about what we're going to do with gas here in the Midwest versus what we do now with coal, a little bit about what will happen with renewables, and then overall resource capacity and adequacy, just quarter our mission, try to make sure, give a feel for, are we going to continue to have enough capacity to serve the load? So there's lots of things going on in the utility industry right now. We have, as a previous speaker talked about, lots of emerging technologies, wind, solar, distributed generation, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We've got the mercury and air toxic rules that are going into place over the next year or two, which are going to cause a lot of coal plants to retire. We've got the carbon standards that were recently promulgated by the EPA, which is going to cause the portfolio to evolve. We've got shale gas that's going on everywhere, and that's changing the use of the gas pipeline infrastructure, making gas available in places it didn't used to be available. It's cheaper, the supply is abundant again, and that's causing a depression on coal as well. We've got the economic recovery. Demand is recovering from the drop we had seen several years ago. And then fundamentally, another big thing that's going on is, from a power pricing point of view, distributed generation in general is causing a big shift in how utilities are going to have to be regulated by their commissions because of the way the depression on energy is going to result. But capacity is still needed because wind, as good as it is, only generates when the wind blows, and solar, as good as it is, only generates when the sun is out. And neither of those things happen all the time, and so you still need other things to back them up. The Clean Power Plan, which was put out in June by the EPA as a draft rule, and there's a lot of activity associated with this, is basically just going to require that we reduce carbon by about 30% from 2005 levels, and there's 4 main ways that that's going to happen. Basically, they assume a heat rate improvement. So basically, they're assuming that we'll be able to make our power plants more efficient. They're assuming that we'll be able to use less coal and use more gas, and that's actually the biggest chunk they're assuming. They're assuming that we'll be able to replace some of the coal with renewables, and they're assuming that we'll be able to get more energy efficiency. A primary example of energy efficiency is light bulb programs. You can replace incandescent bulbs with cheaper LEDs or compact fluorescents and use less electricity. So the combination of those things is what they assume we'll be able to get 30% reduction from. The rule was promulgated. It actually looks like a long timeline. It doesn't actually go into full effect until 2030, but actually it's not very long. The way the rule is, the rule was put out, and then there's comment periods, and then by the time that the states have to issue plans, and then to the time it starts coming into effect, there's only about 4 or 5 years there, and it takes that or longer to build gas plants. So it's really a very, very compressed timeline in order to accomplish this. The other thing is that in order to achieve different levels of reduction, you can't just do one thing. We looked at all kinds of different scenarios, and it takes a combination of a lot of things in order to achieve the reductions they're talking about. You can't just do it with renewables. There's just not enough renewables to do it with. You can't just do it by retiring coal plants because you have to replace it with natural gas, which also emits carbon. And so there's all kinds of trade-offs, and you have to do multiple things in order to make it happen. We did a lot of analysis around what the rule actually says. It's a state-by-state plan. We did a lot of analysis that shows if you try to do it state by state, and each state does the plan on their own, in their own state, without regard to what's happening in their neighbors, it costs a lot more money over time. So the study basically says in order to achieve the 30% reduction that's been talked about, we actually need to do it on a regional basis. And so it's going to require a lot of the states to work together to make that happen. The cost order, no surprise, is not the same as carbon minimization order. So if you look on the left-hand side of that slide, basically wind is cheapest on a variable cost basis, nuclear second, gas is third, and then combustion turbine gas is fourth, and then coal is fifth in terms of carbon. In terms of cost, coal is actually in the middle, and coal is our biggest resource. So this is going to change the economics of the game. It's going to raise the cost of electricity in the end. We don't use that much gas in the Midwest now. We do plan to increase, but even under the scenarios we're talking about over the next 10 years increasing only from about maybe 8% to 14%. We'll still end up using a lot of renewable wind generation. We'll still end up using a lot of gas and nuclear and some coal, but not a huge amount of gas. I think I'll skip that one. So the gas industry. It turns out that over the last years, we've been very fortunate. The gas industry built a lot of pipelines from various places where gas supply is to our part of the country, and they were mainly put there to heat homes, right? They were built for industrial or heating, and the electric utility industry, at least in this part of the country, used so much coal, they didn't actually use very much gas in the winter. Because our winter load isn't as much as our summer load, and our actually peak usage for when we use gas was actually in the summer. And so we were able to rely on pipes that were used for heating in the winter in the summer. And so we didn't have to build pipes twice. Now that's going to change as we start evolving, and we have to use, as we start retiring coal plants, and as we start using more and more gas, we're going to use more gas in the winter, which is going to cause us to have to build more pipes. So there's going to have to be more pipes come in from the Pennsylvania side of things or from the south in order to make that happen. We'll still end up being okay in the summer, but winter is where we could have a problem, and we're going to have to watch very carefully. I'll skip that one. All right, so renewable portfolio standards promulgated by states. This is a nationwide picture, but most of the states in the Midwest do have a renewable portfolio standard. Some of them are actually quite aggressive, in particular Minnesota. And we're actually ahead of that curve. The blue lines on these things, on these graphs, indicate on the U.S. is on the left and our footprint on the right, that basically indicate the requirement. And you can see that the requirement, as going over time, keeps going up. So the state RPSs are requiring us to use more and more renewables as energy, and the utilities and others that are putting the infrastructure in place are actually ahead of that standard, and we keep using more and more of that. Now, as a power system operator, I used to worry about that because it's a problem if when the sun quits. Turns out in the Midwest we don't have a big problem because it's not sunny a lot of times, so we don't have a whole lot of solar going in, but we do have wind. It is windy here. And in particular, northwest Iowa, southwest Minnesota, it's really windy, and a lot of plants started getting put in there. But the problem is that it goes away just like that sometimes. And when it goes away just like that sometimes, we have to replace it with something else or the lights go out. And so I was actually worried about that. But because the renewable standards have been applied across the whole footprint, wind plants are going in across our whole footprint. And the wind doesn't stop at the same time, the wind doesn't start at the same time, and so it's basically become manageable. And we've been able to manage the wind going up and down in a reliable manner. One of the things we've had the benefit of for the last really 30 years is enough capacity to serve the load. We basically require that we operate to a standard where if everything goes well, we will drop load one time every 10 years. Okay, that's our planning standard. You have to plan to something. That's what's been chosen as a reliable standard. In order to achieve that, we need to have a roughly 15% reserve margin. And you can see that over the last few years, we've had well in excess of that. And so we haven't had to take any load measures, no load reduction measures. But that's starting to go away, and as the blue line shows, as the environmental rules go into place, our capacity is going to go down, and as the capacity goes down, we're going to subject our load to potential interruption. The other thing you can see on the right-hand side of the chart is that the coal is reducing, and it's mostly the older coal plants that are going to be retiring, and the renewables are going up and the gas is going up. And so what ends up happening is at a 14.8% reserve margin right there in the middle, we'll end up dropping load about once every 10 years. It's going to be during one of those really, really hot summers when we have a few forced outages and we'll have to interrupt some customers. But as the reserve margin starts reducing, the chances of interruption go up exponentially. And as you get down to even 5%, you have 3 days per year. Not 1 day in 10 years anymore, 3 days per year. So we got to keep a close eye on this, and as capacity gets reduced, try to make sure we're not going to end up in a situation where we're dropping load more often than is acceptable to people. So in conclusion, our industry is evolving. It's evolving in a significant manner. We're going to be trying to use the power system in ways that it hasn't been used in the past. We're going to use the transmission system in ways it hasn't been used in the past. But I think we can do it reliably if we plan carefully. We will have less coal. We will be utilizing more of the other fuel types, in particular renewables. We'll still need to have capacity because, as I indicated, the wind doesn't always blow, and we still have to generate when it doesn't. And we're going to be making use of the gas infrastructure in a significantly different manner over time as well. And so I'm out of time, so thank you.
Questions at the end.
Hello. Hi. Thank you actually to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm an electrical engineer, and this is a rare opportunity for me to talk to, I guess, a more general audience, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So my work in this area, in the power systems area, is often described under the category of this word smart grids. I have, like many of my engineering colleagues, somewhat mixed feelings for this phrase. On the one hand, it's a buzzword. It's sort of like a Web 2.0 or big data or something like that, right? Which means that it means different things to different people. On the other hand, it is a reasonably accurate description for the kind of things that we try to do for the electric grid, and also it resonates well both with specialists and non-specialists, so that's a good thing. So what does the smart grid have to do with renewable energy generation? I would say like everything. So I'll just give a superficial picture of like one of the things that we are trying to do here, and throw out there like one idea which I think would be nice to have as a topic for discussion among a public policy and a general audience. So to take a rather superficial view of like what challenges renewable generation poses for the grid, well, conventional generators like coal, gas-fired plants and so forth, they have these three properties. They are predictable, reliable, and controllable. Reliable in the sense that it's available basically on demand. And renewable generation in the form of wind or solar is neither of these three things. It is not predictable, and it's not reliable in the sense you can turn it on when you want it. And it is controllable only to a limited degree. So one is tempted to throw up our hands and say, well, what are you going to do when the wind is not blowing or when the sun is not shining? So you can never have like a power grid with mostly renewable generation. But I would suggest to you that a moment's thinking would, reveal that to be somewhat of a fallacy. Because after all, it doesn't rain every day, but you turn on your faucet and water still flows, right? So if you think about it for a second, the key here really is storage. If you give me an unlimited amount of storage, then, wind, solar, no matter how unpredictable, how unreliable it is, you can make it reliable, okay? So the problem, of course, is electricity storage is notoriously difficult. It's it's one of those grand challenges, I believe. You can think of it as a disadvantage if you want, but it really is the flip side of electricity being so easy to manipulate and move around. And it's the flip side of the fact that we live in an electrical world, right? So it is just part of the package, really. So if you look at what are the dominant forms of energy storage in the grid as it is today, well, the obvious one is fossil fuels themselves. They are, after all, a very, very long-term form of storage, right? But if you leave that aside, the forms of storage that we use today are rather low-tech and 20th century, okay? So to give a couple of examples, one form of storage that's used in some places is something called pumped storage hydro. What does this mean? This literally means that when you have excess electricity, you use that to pump water back upstream, so that you can store it in large dams and reservoirs that you already have. And then, when you need to, you can let the water flow back downstream and have it run turbines, that sort of thing. The second one, this is pretty interesting, is that now in recent decades, a new use has been found for abandoned mine shafts in places in the Old West. So what we use this for is, these are large, deep holes in the ground, right? So we, put large rocks and, pull them and push them up and down these deep holes, basically, and use that as a form of energy storage as well. So these are a couple of examples, but it gives you a sense of like just, how, even in the year 2014, we still use forms of storage that are like maybe 100 years old or more. And the problems with these is not just that these are unglamorous, but we also believe that they are not quite adequate. If we want to make like a reliable grid with renewable generation, these by itself is not going to be sufficient. So what is the answer? And the answer was alluded to briefly by our previous speaker. It was one of those bullet items under emerging technologies, and this is something called demand response or virtual storage. What does this mean? So I'll give you a simple example to illustrate what this is. So, take a household appliance like a dishwasher. Nominally a dishwasher may draw about like a kilowatt of power, and let's say it runs for a cycle of like 30 minutes or so. The idea behind demand response is maybe you don't need your dishwasher to be really done in 30 minutes. If you're willing to let the grid control your dishwasher so that it finishes sometime in the next 3-4 hours or whenever. Now, the key to this is that wind is unpredictable on a very short time scale. And as you go to longer and longer time scales, you would expect it to become somewhat more predictable. Now, this doesn't quite happen no matter like how large of a time scale you aggregate over. Wind has a way of like remaining unpredictable, but for the moment, at least it's true that it becomes less unpredictable over time. So if you work with that and say, let's say over a 4-hour time period or so, is much more predictable than it is over, let's say, a few minute time period, then giving this sort of flexibility to the grid to manipulate your dishwasher is the rough equivalent of having half a kilowatt hour battery connected to the grid that the grid can dump energy into and then draw out of when needed. Now that's a relatively large size battery, I guess, but if you start thinking about like what other appliances might play a similar role, and there is a lot of focus in the community of researchers working on smart grids on a particular new type of, not appliance really, it's electric vehicles. Why electric vehicles? Because these are interesting. They provide you both real storage and virtual storage, right? Like electric vehicles come with enormous batteries, right? These batteries are typically on the order of like 5, 10, 15 kilowatt hours capacity. And not only that, when you plug these hybrid vehicles into your outlet and let them charge, you have the possibility also of getting virtual storage. Just like a dishwasher, if you allow it to vary its charging rates and so forth, you can get quite a bit of capacity out of that. Now this is exciting, and some of the work we do is basically figuring out like how to get the most juice out of capabilities just like this. But I want to close here by suggesting that this is also like more than a technical issue. Currently, the big problem with like charging electric vehicles is that most outlets, like in residences and parking lots and so forth, electric vehicles are like more power hungry than just about any other appliance you can think of. Okay, so if you use like an outlet in your garage right now, that outlet just cannot supply power at the rate at which the electric vehicle can absorb it. And as a result, it's slow to charge these things unless you have like specialized charging stations and so forth. And this you might imagine creates like a bit of a hindrance in widespread adoption of electric vehicles, that sort of thing. So there is a big push, like new homes being built on the West Coast and so forth. They have like special outlets in the garages that can supply large amounts of current, that sort of thing. Now that's a good thing. I want to suggest though that there is a danger here. And the danger is this, and it's somewhat subtle, okay? So there is, a chance for us to create a cultural norm here, basically, okay? So these electric vehicles with their large batteries and their capacity for virtual storage can be really powerful, but only when you allow it to, right? Like if the default assumption becomes that, hey, look, I want my electric vehicle to be like exactly a replacement for a gasoline vehicle, which is to say I need to have this like charged whenever I need it, within like, let's say 2 or 3 minutes. And then when I'm done, I'm going to unplug it. Then it's of not only no use to the grid, it's actually like, it's creating more problems because you're going to create these enormous spikes of usage whenever you plug one of these things for charging, that sort of thing. And, far from helping renewable adoption, it is going to create major headaches, frankly. So what can we do? Well, I would argue that, there are other instances where we have successfully created social norms that say, encourage people to more, I guess, pro-social behaviors, I guess, right? So the examples I can think of was, we are now developing like norms, for instance, against risky driving behaviors, right? As much as you would want to, for instance, answer your phone or like do text messaging on your smartphone while driving, we know better than not to do that. Even though these things might be like personal annoyances and inconveniences, we accept that, it's best for everyone overall if we avoid doing these things. Another thing is there is a strong temptation, I guess, to say like, well, you want to encourage people to, plug in their vehicles. Well, this is only an example. Electric vehicles I'm using as an example for something broader. Maybe you can just give them pricing incentives. It's not that I'm dismissive of pricing incentives, but my own feeling is that individuals don't respond nearly as well to price incentives. So something more than that is needed, and I'm thinking for this forum that might be an interesting topic to think about and discuss maybe. That's mostly all I have. So thank you very much once again for the opportunity, and I look forward to a discussion.
All right, so thank you again to the organizers for the invitation to speak here today. So I'm going to be talking about sort of the synergy between energy storage and renewable integration. Talk about some of the, I guess, needs that renewable integration has in terms of energy storage needs and opportunities, and then also some of the challenges that that raises as well. So the basic background that I always like to say whenever talking about renewable integration, renewables don't necessarily need storage. What they really need is flexibility in the power system. And what this figure here, which I pulled from an NREL, fairly recent NREL technical report, is meant to demonstrate is that there are lots of different potential sources of flexibility that we can get into our power systems, both on the supply and on the demand side. And even though storage gets discussed a lot in the context of renewable integration, the harsh reality is that today most storage technologies are pretty costly compared to alternative sources of flexibility. And so, by and large, most power systems today, we've been able to accommodate and integrate renewables without needing massive deployments of energy storage. Again, one can look at MISO, ERCOT, California as examples of that, where there hasn't been massive amounts of storage added to the power system. Instead, what we've done is basically redesign of markets, using flexible generation, such as natural gas, combustion turbines, oil turbines, things of that sort. Now, the counterpoint to that, of course, is that at higher penetrations with more and more renewables, storage is at some point going to become the marginal source of flexibility. And so there is going to be a point at which we do need storage to enter the system. And to give a good example of this, I pulled this quote out of the fairly recent Renewable Electricity Future Study, which was conducted by NREL. And what they say here is that the analysis found that storage is, in fact, an attractive option to increase electric system flexibility, primarily due to the ability of storage to shift load to better correlate with output from variable generators, and to also reduce renewable curtailment by storing excess generation in times of either low demand, binding transmission constraints, binding generator constraints, and to also provide firm capacity for a variety of reserve services. And so, for example, in the study, they found that in the 80% renewable energy scenarios, storage deployment was found to increase from today in the US, we have about 20 gigawatts of pumped hydroelectric storage, to about 100 or 152 gigawatts of storage. And in REFs, this storage, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, was primarily pumped hydroelectric storage and compressed air energy storage. And that was primarily guided by the assumptions that went into the analysis in terms of what the relative costs of different storage technologies were. Pumped hydro and Ks tended to be the most cost-effective storage options that were modeled in that analysis. Now, again, an important caveat, and this goes back to what I was showing on that other figure, is that at the end of the day, storage still has to compete against other alternatives. So this is now the continuation of that quote from the REF's executive summary, which says that demand-side options, meaning demand response, getting customers to shift their consumption around, run the dishwasher in the middle of the night, charge the electric vehicle, allow the system operator, the utility, to determine when the electric vehicle is charged overnight, was found to play a significant role also in meeting the integration challenge in the 80% scenario. So they saw an increase in demand response from the roughly 16 gigawatts we had deployed in 2009 to about 28 to 48 gigawatts of demand response in the 80% renewable scenarios. And so the only point here is to say that although storage does have a role to play in renewable integration, obviously it has alternatives and other sources of flexibility to compete against. What does storage do for renewables? So the quote that I pulled from the REF sort of referred to this. So one role that it has to play has to do with curtailment. The reality is that there will be increasingly at higher penetrations situations in which the system simply cannot take more renewable generation. Today, for example, in Texas, Texas deals quite a lot with transmission-related curtailment. So a good example of this, back in the early 2000s, lots of wind due to favorable subsidies and other policies of that sort was installed in western Texas. The load pockets in ERCOT happened to be in eastern Texas, and you had lots of transmission bottlenecks which prevented the wind generation from getting to customers and load in eastern Texas. So in 2002, they had about 380 gigawatt hours of wind that was curtailed. That was an estimated cost of about $22 million of lost revenue as a result of that. If you had some sort of storage plant co-located with your wind plant, you could store the excess energy when the transmission line is congested. Later on, when the wind stops blowing, you can discharge your storage plant and use the then available transmission capacity. You can also run into situations where you have to curtail the output of your renewable generators because of other generators, conventional generators in the system, not being sufficiently flexible to take that generation. So Spain and Denmark are two good examples of this today. Spain runs into lots of situations on spring days when it's relatively windy, you don't have a lot of heating or cooling load, and so you have wind could presumably pick up 70, 80% plus of the system's load, but because you can't shut all your conventional generators off, you need them in case the wind dies down to pick up load, whatever other reasons. You have to actually curtail the output of your wind plants. Denmark is a little bit fortunate in this regard because they happen to be interconnected with Scandinavia and Germany. So Even though Denmark has, within the country itself, presumably lots of binding generator-related curtailment issues, they can usually just export energy to neighboring countries and sort of get around this to some extent. In the United States, how do we see this playing out? So a good example that this figure here demonstrates, California is looking forward to what the ISO there refers to as the duck curve. So this is showing here the net load, which is load less wind and solar generation. So this is historical from 2012, 2013, and then projected out into future years. The two things that you notice, if you look at, for example, that 2020 load profile, in the middle of the day, you're starting to hit minimum load requirements on your conventional generators. So you're getting so much output from rooftop and utility scale PV, concentrating solar power, that you actually have to start curtailing it because you can't shut your nuclear, coal-fired generators, whatever, off. They start hitting binding minimum operating points. The other thing that they get to look forward to is every afternoon, the sun sets, so the output of your PV plants drops off, and there's a 2 or 3 hour lag before it starts getting windy in the middle of the night. So there's a really, really steep ramp in the net load curve, and so you need enough flexible generation available in the afternoon that can quickly increase basically the system's output from about 12 gigawatts up to about 26 gigawatts. So you need 14 gigawatts of ramping capability within a 3 to 4 hour window there to deal with what happens each afternoon as the sun sets. The other major role that storage can play for renewables has to do with balancing. So basically, as I suggested before, providing flexibility to maintain supply and demand balance. And this can range from very fine scale frequency regulation type applications to operating in firm reserves, and then intra and inter-hour ramping as well in the middle. One caveat that I always like to stress, and I harp on probably too much, is that storage should not be used, even though it gets discussed a lot, to firm the output of a single renewable plant or to make a renewable appear to be a dispatchable generator. So even though this gets discussed far too often, it's a bad idea. And the reason is because at the end of the day, the power system cares about system-wide supply and demand balance. It doesn't care about how much a particular wind plant is producing. And so doing this basically eliminates the benefits of spatial diversification that was discussed earlier. So if you have one part of the state is windier than you expected, another is less windy than you expected, you're storing the energy, the excess energy from the windy area, and you're discharging energy from the not so windy area. You're throwing energy away by storing and discharging at the same time. The system, on the whole, should look at how much supply and demand there is and balance it, not use storage to balance the output of individual renewable plants. So that's a little bit about what role storage has to play in renewable integration. As I said, the other thing I want to talk really briefly about are some of the challenges. So as I said at the outset, the renewable electricity future studies and other renewable integration studies that are modeling massive penetration. So here in REFs, I'm talking about 80% renewable on an energy basis. The way they're able to do this, in large part, the way they're able to get away with it, is by building massive amounts of storage. And in REFs, for example, that was primarily pumped hydro and Ks. REFs, for example, assumes that there's about 35 gigawatts of pumped hydro capacity that's not been exploited in the US. These are either greenfield or brownfield plants, and about 120 gigawatts of case potential as well. The harsh reality is the market has not delivered a case plant since the McIntosh plant was built back 20, 30 years ago. So we had the Iowa Stored Energy Park, the Norton Energy Storage Project. Both of those were attempted both of those failed for a variety of reasons. Similar story, we haven't seen a pumped hydro plant built in the US in some time either. That's not to say that it can't be, but it begs the question, are these studies a little too optimistic in terms of how much storage capacity can actually be built by the system? The other thing, as far as the challenge is concerned, has to do with market design. So lots of these studies assume that you have centralized planning going on. Basically, you have a central planner that is determining how much storage gets built, determining how to operate it, so on and so forth. In practice, storage investment and operation is going to be determined by independent profit-driven firms. And so how you design the market, how you remunerate storage plants for providing renewable integration services is going to dictate whether storage actually enters the market. In the US, for example, today, most of the organized markets basically socialize the operational cost impacts of renewables. So renewables are largely protected from imbalance charges. They don't have to pay penalties when they over or underproduce compared to what was expected. And so there's not necessarily a clear market signal that says, well, if you can provide this flexibility to the system, we're going to pay you for doing that. The direction in the US so far seems to be introducing new market products. So for example, in California, they've introduced this product called the FlexiRamp product. It's supposed to be something between an energy and a reserve product, and it's supposed to provide a price signal for providing flexibility to the system. So again, just to conclude, storage does have a renewable integration role to play. At today's costs and today's penetrations, it's probably too costly to actually use as a flexibility source, but it's going to be vitally important at higher penetrations. It's not clear how much the actual potential for PHS and Ks are, and as I said before, there are market design and regulatory issues that probably need to be further worked out to make sure that storage has proper incentives to enter the market and provide these services. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. How are you? I have the rather unenviable task of being the fourth speaker on the first panel after lunch, which means I'm going to try something here to just kind of energize the room. So I wanted to let you know that I'm very amped to be here, charged to be part of this wonderful panel, and I hope that my remarks provide you with some utility. Actually, thank you again to Professor Carlson and especially to Leslie Gannon for the logistics. It's all been fantastic. I appreciate the Public Policy Center inviting me to speak here. And I am going to talk to you today about the administration's efforts to modernize the grid and bring around a 21st century infrastructure, which, as you've heard, I think, throughout the morning and even on the panel just now, there are a certain number of challenges in doing that. You'll hear about cost and technology being challenges when in the discussion, the literature, and symposiums like this. I think someone this morning said that, in fact, we've gotten to a point where costs are coming down, the technology's there. I think that the real challenges are in the infrastructure itself, and I don't mean just the wires on the ground, I mean the regulatory infrastructure that has led to the wires on the ground and the way they are, and in doing it in a way that is sustainable and friendly to the earth and the environment. So before I actually get into speaking about what the administration has been doing and the efforts that are underway, if you will, indulge me for a minute, because I think it's important to draw context and to provide a little bit of the historical background on how we got here. So I'm going to start with a news flash. Not really. The grid is imperfect. So the grid we know today is obviously, it actually began with a series of isolated power generation systems across the Northeast in the late 1800s, 1880s. And I'm sure that most of the folks in this room are familiar with that, but I'm going to dig into the history for just a second because, again, I think it is informative to explain how we got here and how ingrained into the DNA of our nation's electric grid some of the challenges are. So we evolved, the grid we have evolved as a patchwork of essentially systems that were built on a generator by generator basis. And they transported power from large power plants to the end users, to the consumers. Now, there was actually a moment in history in the late 1880s when things might have gone a different way. So I think folks are familiar with the fact that Edison is who we have to credit, largely credit with designing and introducing the first electric power system. In 1882, he used a jumbo dynamo to create about 110 kilowatts of power to power about 59 stores on Pearl Street in New York City. And by the way, it was done at the equivalent of what would be $5 per kilowatt hour, which is a far cry from the 12 cents or so that we're paying on average these days. He had help from this guy named Tesla. And, you know, small city systems started popping up because who doesn't want to have lights at night? And that meant that city governments started getting involved because they were sort of the primary first consumers, right? They were building trolley systems, they were building city systems. And because they were involved, city government, I think someone asked earlier, what does this mean what does this all mean locally, right? City governments were our first regulators. And because it was local politics, you had folks that had trade-offs, deals for right-of-ways. You know, things were going on, but it was very localized. Then along comes a gentleman named Westinghouse. You may have heard of him. He's got this nifty little gadget, it's a transformer. And it turns out that Westinghouse's invention allowed him to build this little outfit on the banks of the Niagara Falls that powered the city of Buffalo 20 miles away. And so what you have now is technologically the capacity to have centralized power that is transported. Well, guess what? State governments are like, we can't let cities do this. So the state governments start getting involved, right? Now, I love history because there's always drama in history. So if you'll permit me to digress for just 2 minutes. Westinghouse actually was aided in large measure by a gentleman named Nikola Tesla, who had been friends with Edison. But their big falling out was on whether electric power should be delivered by alternating current or by direct current. And Edison was a staunch believer in direct current. Westinghouse and Tesla, most of the patents on the transformer and on the distributed system came from, on the power generation system that Westinghouse used were Tesla's. But they launched a smear campaign against each other. And if you go back and look at the historical record in New York in the 1880s, 1890s, I mean, to the point of where Edison, who was a very staunch opponent of the death penalty, ended up essentially driving the invention of the electric chair because he was looking for ways to prove that direct current was very, very dangerous. Alternating current was very, very dangerous, that high voltage was bad for you. Anyway, I digress. Let me come back to the point at hand. Okay, so with the advent of the first transformer, essentially what you have are high voltage transmission lines that are now becoming possible crisscrossing the country. And ever since then, no one's really questioned that model, right? We just add on to it. It's like owning a 1970 Datsun and just continuing to throw money at it to fix it without ever sort of stopping and asking yourself if that's truly the infrastructure you want, right? That's where we are. And essentially, vertically integrated public utilities like this start going beyond city limits, and states get involved In 1914, 30 states had regulatory commissions. They all do now today. Ultimately, what this led to in the 1930s was the Federal Power Act of 1935, which led to the creation of FERC. And here's where I'm going to start layering stuff, and it's all going to come full circle in just a second. In addition to the creation of FERC in 1935, we're dealing with New Deal era politics. Congress also passed, at the behest and help of the White House, the Rural Electrification Act, which is part of the New Deal, part of putting people back to work, part of bringing electricity to the whole country, right? So now you have at least 2 agencies in Washington that are interested and involved in bringing power to the people. And I say this all to underscore, I think, a theme, right? The concept of generating, let alone transporting large quantities of remotely generated, small, intermittent power, was never, ever, ever anticipated, not part of the original construction of our electric infrastructure. So here we are, fast forward, and now we're trying to figure out, well, how do we fix this? What do we do to allow these great advances in renewable energy that we have? And so that brings me to the administration's efforts. I think, and I do want to leave this one sentence with you. Actually, before I do that, Mr. Bryce was waving around an iPhone earlier, and it struck me, I just have to make this analogy. Edison would have no clue what to do with a smartphone. But you know what? He would be completely comfortable with the grid we have, because it's the same frickin' grid. Fricking, I said fricking. So, the grid of the future, right? A well-functioning grid is one that is going to provide an abundant amount of capacity. It will be reliable. It is going to deliver that electricity efficiently. It's going to provide certainty for markets. And it's going to be good to Mother Nature in doing all of that. How do we get there? Just like eating an elephant, small baby steps. So let me tell you about what the administration is doing. Since the beginning of the administration, we've been committed to building a cleaner, more secure energy future. And I have actually been neglecting my slides, which are just pretty pictures of what we're working on. This, by the way, is a visual representation of the interconnections that we have in the country, artifact of the system that has just evolved. And that's a more sort of descriptive picture of the different independent system operators. So what we are doing since the beginning of his presidency, President Obama made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases by 17%, below the 2005 levels by 2020. In his first term, we doubled the renewable energy production of the country, and in his climate action plan that was issued in June of last year, we committed to again double renewable energy production by 2020. And the government likes to lead, the federal government likes to say, and we do, lead by example. The General Services Administration, which manages all of the federal buildings, thousands of them, just last month signed a contract to purchase 140 megawatts of wind power from a project that's going to be right here across the Iowa state line. Actually, I think it's in Illinois. And to date, we've permitted 50 utility-scale renewable energy projects on public lands, which powers nearly 5 million homes and supports has supported in the construction more than 20,000 jobs. But modernizing our grid, we recognize, takes some institutional changes, right? And so one of the key components of the administration's strategy has been to develop what we call the rapid response team transmission team, we like acronyms, so I just call it the RRTT. And essentially what the Rapid Response Transmission Team, the RRTT, does is actually modernize, rejuvenate, renovate sort of the way that planning, permitting, siting, and the building of long-distance transmission lines happens in our country. So in 2009, we signed an MOU with the 9 agencies that all have pieces and parts of this, right? And my agency, the Council on Environmental Quality, is spearheading that interagency effort. We've got 7 pilot projects that are happening across the country. There's one actually just north of here in the Twin Cities area called the CapEx 2020. And essentially what we're doing is saying that, let's see, these are the pilot projects across the country. The idea is that we would, let me just do this. I'm actually looking, here it is. I'm going to read to you the list of statutes that we're trying to sort of harmonize. The Rapid Response Team essentially has a couple of key components, right? First, we want to designate a single federal point of contact for all federal authorizations so that you have a single record for the project and you set clear timelines for agency review and coordination, and that means that you do take the time to do the appropriate cultural, historic, and environmental reviews. But you don't duplicate. You don't have 5 agencies doing the same thing and possibly coming out with different conclusions, right? So this, what I was looking for is, I just want to read the list of statutes that are involved in the planning, siting, and federal permitting of lines. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act. I mean, there are a myriad of statutes, and folks, this just goes back to the point that I was telling you. Just like our grid has evolved, so too has our regulatory scheme and our regulatory structure. And so what we're doing with the President's initiatives, we are working on finding ways to expedite the processes, to help be smarter and put a little foresight and a little planning into the way we do transmission in this country. So I think my time is up, so I'm going to wrap up really quickly here. One of the outcomes of the RRT has been the identification of a pre-application process to help us achieve these goals and to get greater coordination. And this is a picture of the Dry Lake area in Nevada. In addition to doing this, we're doing this, as I said, in a way that's good to Mother Nature. And we're protecting the environment. And so the Dry Lake area of Nevada is an area where they did essentially what's called advanced mitigation. They did a landscape scale approach and review of the solar projects that went into this entire area. And they looked at it all at once. Fish and Wildlife worked with FERC, worked with all of the DOE, all of the other agencies involved in the project, and were able to cite this in a way that focused on studying the impacts, the environmental impacts, putting in monitoring and putting in adaptive management and mitigation control techniques at the beginning. And they were able to do it in a very timely way to bring that capacity online very quickly. And then I have the picture of windmills here just to say, the Fish and Wildlife Service has also, I think folks in this room are probably very familiar with the Fish and Wildlife's guidelines for wind turbine energy. And that is, again, a tiered approach of looking at how to bring renewable energy into the grid in a way that's protective and safe of the environment. So thank you.
Thank you guys very much for your attention. The only thing worse than being the 4th person after lunch, being the 5th. So it is a good opportunity. Going so late in the process, though, it is nice because my other speakers have set me up quite so well, talking about the various challenges we've got from a central generation, central system standpoint. What I want to focus on right now, though, is how to look at a set of challenges, and they're really challenges because they're different. And we've talked a lot about these challenges at sort of a large scale sort of thought process, sort of things that you can see. You drive by, you see a large wind turbine, you see a large power plant being built, something like that. But there are also a lot of changes going on, not at the large scale level, but also at the small scale level, actually in neighborhoods or on commercial buildings near your home. Maybe they're inside your home, your thermostat, your dishwasher, all this new types of equipment. How are they going to affect the system, as Manisha just said, is sort of evolved over time, and it's focused on a couple key concepts. So what I want to do is go over those key concepts. What are the new changes that we're looking at, especially on the distribution system, and how we can make those challenges become opportunities. All right? So traditional electric power system, I won't go over the history, pretty much covered already. From an economy of scale standpoint, it's much cheaper, as we can imagine, to generate electricity in vast quantities. So power plants became larger and larger because from an economy of scale standpoint, it was much cheaper to do it. The other thing, though, that's characteristic of our system today, for the most part, is how people use electricity. When you go home, you cook dinner, you maybe do some laundry, you watch TV, you turn on lights on and off, those types of things. People tend to follow, the electricity use follows behavioral patterns of people. It's somewhat predictable. And the other key characteristic is that power generally flows one way. We think about the system, it flows from the central generator through the transmission into the distribution system and to your house. Not much flowing around once you get past the transmission network. So key features of the system that has really to this point served us very well. It's been a huge driver of economic growth. It's been an opportunity for sort of sustained development of our society. So I don't want to really tear down the electric system as it is. It's been very useful. What's changing? So there are a lot of new things happening on a local level that you may or may not see personally, but are happening around the country. One thing we are seeing is a resurgence of combined heat and power. That is, locally having some sort of generation source, either a fuel cell or a generator, something where you can capture not only the generated electricity, but also the heat. Use it, especially during the wintertime or during the summer if you have some kind of chiller, that type of thing. What else is happening is loads are changing. So how we use electricity and what we're able to control with regards to our energy use is changing pretty rapidly. Anybody have a Nest thermostat yet? No? Okay, programmable thermostats are picking up. They aren't just a toy anymore. They're still kind of hovering on that edge of being kind of cool, gee whiz. But especially in places where you're starting to see time of use pricing, you're seeing a lot of different incentives for changing your energy use. You're starting to see things like home energy management really pick up. Electric vehicles. As we see volatility in gas prices, you're starting to see electric vehicle adoption, especially out in California, west coming east. Different forms of solar. Solar, because of just the nature of being a whole bunch of small panels, a lot of times doesn't have the same economy of scale benefits as, for instance, of wind, where I can put in one large wind turbine and it's a lot easier for me to do and take advantage of wind resources in one area. Solar tends to be a little bit more interspersed, tends to be a little easier to accommodate at the distribution level. So you are seeing those happen in places that are not typically on the supply side of the equation. So altogether, these resources we think of as at EPRI, we call distributed energy resources, kind of a common industry term. But it's not just generation, but also load, and all of these things are happening sort of their own accord. Not in really, as we talked about centralized planning, there's not one organization that's determining exactly where these things are going to happen. They're happening in a very organic fashion. So the net effect of having those is it's changing the way power flows in the system. Rather than just going one way, following those natural patterns of how we think we use electricity, they're now flowing two-way. There's opportunities to shift our consumption, to generate during the middle of the day. All of that's happening from the distribution system going back up onto transmission. So it is a fundamental change in the way power is distributed, and something that affects not only the supply side of the equation, but also how energy is delivered. So with our system, though, even though we've got all these new things kind of happening on the distribution system, there are some fundamentals that we really want to keep with the system that we have. It makes sense. Reliable electricity. Having electricity 24/7 when I want to, not just when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, but when I want to use electricity, we still want the capability. We also want the ability to start loads up. It's a lot of stress to start up certain loads, like air conditioners. They need that instantaneous kick to get started, and that's a lot of stress on a local system. But with the grid, having a good, strong grid that's built and centrally connected between different resources, we're able to provide that startup power very easily. And then quality power. So some devices are sensitive. They need that continuous stream that doesn't vary. It doesn't have a whole lot of electrical garbage in it. Making sure that we have quality power to run those devices in a reliable, predictable manner. Those are things that regardless of what kinds of devices are generating and where we're generating the power, that we need those characteristics are going to be part of the system and need to be part of the system from here on. So if we take those characteristics that we're used to on the left, we want to retain those, but is there an opportunity having these new types of resources on the system? Do they open up new opportunities that we've not been looking at previously? We think about having generation sources that are close to load. We don't have to transmit energy as far. There's a potential to reduce the amount of losses that we have on the system. If we have some sort of supply side issue, there's a tree falling on a feeder somewhere, or we have a transmission line outage, if you have local generation running under the right interconnection rules, which we haven't even touched yet, but they have the ability to run load locally, is there an opportunity for our power system to be more resilient? So does this, having these resources connected to the distribution system opens up lots of new opportunities, looking at how we think about electricity, not just supply and demand. So this new paradigm, though, like I said, you don't get the benefits without a little bit of investment. So we think about how to meet this challenge. What do we need? Because the system that we have right now has been so adequately said, it does support that one-way power flow. It is designed for large central generators. So how do we think about creating a world where we can maximize the value we get from all the resources? So the first one we think about is being able to sort of modernize the grid. And so I think the term smart grid gets thrown around a lot. It's about having visibility, yes, but it's also about having infrastructure in the right places. The grid very much can be thought of like a system of pipes or a system of roads. And so it's making sure that when you have enough traffic for an 8-lane highway, that you actually have an 8-lane highway there to support it. Making sure there's enough copper, making sure there's enough infrastructure in the right places to support these resources that are now coming online. And thinking about that, getting out and deploying that infrastructure. Having the ability for these resources, most of them are behind a customer meter. They're on your side of the quote-unquote imaginary wall, where the utility or the person who's trying to orchestrate this overall supply-demand balancing may not have visibility of these resources. So he may not know what's out there. So making sure that we have the communications infrastructure and we have the standards in order for these resources to be used. And making sure that when something happens on the grid, like there's a fault somewhere, something falls across a line, or we have an outage of a generator, that these resources, they respond in a way that actually helps the system. Right now, there are a lot of situations where if something negative happens elsewhere, actually the way we've got the standards and codes written, these DER don't support the grid, and actually they create a negative situation instead. So we've got to work on those standards and those communication practices and making sure that we can rectify that. And then it's also how we think about the system, how we plan and operate the system. Because right now, the way you have one operator on sort of one side of the transmission network, the ISO or the transmission operator, who does that sort of supply and demand balancing. That's their major function, and making sure they get those large amounts of electricity in bulk where they're supposed to go. Then there's the other operator, the distribution operator, who's controlling, looking for how that electricity gets delivered to individual customers. And these two may or may not communicate from one to the other. And so as we get more and more generation on the distribution side of the fence, making sure that those two can coordinate and collaborate in how they plan for that generation and how they actually operate their system on a day-to-day basis. And then it's making sure that all of these technical challenges actually make it to the policy and the regulatory environment. Previous speaker just said, not only on an infrastructure standpoint, but also on a policy standpoint, we still operate in that kind of top-down mentality. So it's making sure that the technical challenges and the way that those manifest themselves actually get to the regulator, and the regulators make smart decisions and informed decisions in how to police and sort of regulate the system. So we've got a couple different options. So right now, we've done a great job at connecting these DER. We've allowed them to connect to the system and done a good job supporting them there, but they're not really integrated into the system. So we can sort of continue along that way, not integrating them. If you keep along that process, you end up sort of fragmenting the grid. You end up with a lot of individual energy sources in various places, and the system is not coordinated at all, and just kind of comes apart. Obviously, that's not a good thing. So what we want to see, though, is those resources get integrated. And so right now, there's two ways we can move, right? We can move to this sort of defection model where everybody's kind of man for himself, and you've got your own energy sources, and you're not able to rely on your neighbor. You're not able to pool resources, and you're not able to operate as reliably as we have over the past 100 years. But if we're able to fully integrate these resources, it's possible to take these challenges that we have from an infrastructure standpoint and turn those into opportunities. So this concept, I just kind of gave you guys a high-level presentation of what's going on the distribution system, how you can think about those resources. This and more is in a concept paper we did back in February. If you guys are interested, it's available on our website. Along with some other things. So with that, I guess I'm the last speaker. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. If we're going to stay on time, we have about 8 minutes for questions of any of the panelists. So right down here.
So I would contend that the majority of the U.S. population do not understand that when you plug something into the wall or turn on a light switch, that power is actually being generated at that instant somewhere else. And I would like to know, is there something that we can do or that you can do to help educate the general population on how best to use electricity, because I think that's part of the issue.
Who wants to take that on?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and so that's one of the things as EPRI, we're a nonprofit research institute for the electricity industry and for the public benefit. So we've worked a lot trying to take those technical understandings and try and relate them and tried a number of different sort of analogies and methods, and so we're continuing to try and communicate. And once you progress through different issues, first thing is communicating that just-in-time energy consumption, but also thinking that, it is your ability not only to provide that energy and capacity, but also the inrush is even a step beyond that. So yeah, we're continuing to work on that. And actually, that's the subject of an upcoming white paper we have hopefully early next year.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I mean, I spoke about the challenges and barriers we have with updating our transmission grid, but it is actually a phenomenal thing, right? We have 6 million miles of transmission and distribution lines in this country, which, just to give you a frame of reference, that's like going to the moon and back 1,300 times. It's an amazing amount of wiring we have in this country. And there are a number of programs. I think DOE has the Green Button Initiative and a number of different things on their website that are sort of geared to and aimed at educating the public about this, right? Because, I mean, that's the damnable thing about an electron, right? It's you got to use it right then and there. And so I think that your point is a very valid one and well taken, and I know certainly that the various federal agencies have aspects of their websites that sort of speak to the public and help educate on this. And like I said, the DOE.gov Green Button is a great site for that kind of thing.
We have another question from the audience?
Yeah, right here. This is a question for Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, you talked about the advantages of a regional approach to meeting the EPA Clean Power Plan goals. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sort of strategies might be employed within the MISO region, what the motivation would be for Iowa to participate in a regional approach given our relatively small 16% reduction requirement in the goal, and third, whether a carbon tax within the MISO region is a strategy that probably wouldn't be countenanced, but whether it's actually possible, I guess I'm curious to know.
I don't know if I can answer the all of that, but I mean, because there are varied strategies for how to deal with this. Whether it's similar to when 4 entities need a little bit of power, they can build one plant and share in the cost cheaper than each of the 4 can build one. And so they build jointly owned units everywhere. Same kind of thing holds true here. We've got to add more gas, for example. If you do it state by state, it's each state's got to do that. If they're just looking at just themselves, they would each do it rather than cooperate and rely jointly. The same thing's true for renewables. How can we structure this so that areas that have more wind can put more wind there for the benefit of everybody else? Now, as far as the compensation or whatever would have to go back and forth, those are things that the states are going to have to work out, and I agree it's going to be very complicated, but there's a lot of savings to be had if we can make that work.
Other question? Yes, Professor Throgmorton.
Well, again, I want to thank you for the presentations. They're very enlightening about the details of the grid. But I must admit, I am profoundly struck by how human-centric the discussion has been, not just here this afternoon, but earlier this morning and last night. And how that, I believe, demonstrates absence of awareness that we are in what biologists consider the midst of the 6th great mass extinction of life on Earth. And the farther you project the situation out in the future, the more serious the problem becomes, in which case to be human-centric is to be blind to the consequences of our actions. So in the end, what I really would like somebody to answer coherently is why, at a minimum, we do not assign a price to the social and environmental costs associated with the production and use of fossil-based fuels. And that could be done, as I mentioned last night, by doing what the Citizens Climate Lobby advocates, which is to have a revenue-neutral fee and dividend approach, which means, basically, to have the equivalent of a tax based on each ton of carbon used by any particular fossil fuel or associated with any particular fossil fuel, with all the revenue being redistributed back to the households of the country, in which case one would think it would be completely politically palatable. So, I think I'm raising 2 points. Why don't we demonstrate awareness of the effects of our energy, electricity actions on life on Earth? And secondly, why don't we price the environmental costs of energy use? Thanks.
So, I mean, I'll answer that question from at least my company's perspective, which is that it's not our role to do that on our own, but it is our role to make sure that we, serve our members and serve our stakeholders in a manner that meets the social policies that are put in place by the government at the time. And so if that is promulgated, then our role would be to operate in a way that made that happen. And that's what we would do.
So,
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. I think in the United States we have a patchwork of second or third best policies and regulations. So renewable fuel standards, renewable portfolio standards, ITCs, RPCs, all sorts of subsidies and distortions in the market. Ultimately, there's an externality associated with fossil fuel use. It should be priced, and that should hopefully set the right incentives for things to change.
yeah, and I agree. I think that in principle, everything that you're talking about is exactly what the President's Climate Action Plan and many of the administration's policies are sort of designed to get at. The administration's already has efforts underway to sort of think about the social cost of carbon, but I find it very instructive that the sort of responses that Ramteen and Mr. Gardner just gave, that it's not easy getting federal policy done, right? Because you've got a disparate and varying number of voices that come to the table on these issues. And so I think that when folks like you raise your voice, and if enough people raise their voice, and if people can see that what we have here is a common purpose and a common goal, we can get there. But I think that is sort of the straightforward and succinct answer you were looking for, is that yes, I think we should be working towards that, and getting there takes some effort and time. We just have to be willing to put it in.
Okay, I think our time is up. Please join me in thanking our panel.